Then the Buddha thought, who should I teach first? The person must be interested in the Dharma and quick to understand it. First he thought of his old teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. But they had both died. Then he remembered his 5 ascetic friends, Kondana, Badya, Vapa, Mahanama, and Asaji. When he found out that they were living at Sarnath, near Varanasi, he left to find them. At Sarnath, when the 5 ascetics saw the Buddha coming, they decided not even to greet him or talk to him. They still thought that he was greedy and had given up his search for truth. But as he got closer, that he was surrounded by a brilliant light and looked very noble. They were so astonished that they forgot about their previous decision. They greeted him, offered him some water and quickly prepared a seat. After sitting down, the Buddha told them, "Monks, I have the truth of the end of suffering, nirvana, and the way to end suffering. If you learn and practice it, you will soon become enlightened. You must take responsibility for working to understand these things." At first, the 5 monks doubted his words and asked him many questions, but finally, they began to trust him and wanted to hear his teaching. And so the Buddha gave his first teaching to the 5 monks at Sarnath. The Buddha taught them the 4 noble truths. The first noble truth was about the fact that suffering exists. The second was about the cause of suffering. The third was that it is possible to end suffering, and the fourth explained the path to be followed if you want to end suffering. During this first teaching, Kondana understood everything and attained the first stage of enlightenment. Then he asked the Buddha to ordain him as a monk. Soon the other 4 also joined the Buddha's order. All 5 monks practiced diligently, and with the help of the Buddha they soon became fully enlightened ones. The Buddha continued teaching at Deer Park in Sarnath. After hearing the teachings, Yasa, a young man from a wealthy family, and his best friends left home and became monks. Later, 50 young men from high caste families also left their homes and joined the Buddha's monastic community. When the Buddha had 60 monks as his disciples, students, he held a meeting. He told them, "Go and spread the Dharma to other places, to give more people the chance of gaining freedom from suffering. Spread the Dharma so that human lives may be purified and brightened. There are people ready for the Dharma. They will be able to understand it. I will go to teach at Uruvela." After the Buddha sent out his 60 Arahant disciples for the first time, he traveled to Magadha in the southeast, to Uruvela village. After hearing the Buddha's teaching, many men left their homes and became monks. Later, more than 1,000 of them became fully enlightened Arahants. Then the Buddha took his Arahant disciples to Rajagaha. He went to teach and enlighten King Bimbisara and his people, as he had previously promised the king. After hearing the Dharma, King Bimbisara took refuge in the Buddha and became his follower. Later, he donated Vilavana Park as a residence for the Buddha and the monks. Vilavana became the first Buddhist monastery. One morning, on his way from Vilavana to beg for his daily alms food, the Buddha came across a young man named Sagala. The man was bowing to the east, south, west and north. Then he saluted the sky above and the earth below. He finished by scattering seeds in these 6 directions. The Buddha asked him why he did such things. Sagala replied that his father, before he died, asked him to do this ritual daily, to protect himself from any evil that might happen to him. The Buddha then explained to Sagala what his father had really meant. By asking him to bow in the 6 directions, his father really wanted him to remember, respect, and be kind to all living beings in all directions. By doing this, he would create good karma and he would be protected. Finally, the Buddha instructed Sagala not to kill, steal, be unfaithful to his wife, lie or take intoxicants. These are the training rules, known as the 5 precepts. During the Buddha's stay near Rajagaha, there was a well-known teacher of one of the traditional schools. He had about 200 students, and among them were Upatissa and Kalita. These 2 students were best friends. They wanted to learn more about life and death than their teacher had been able to teach them. So they agreed with each other that they would search for the highest knowledge, and as soon as one of them found it, he would share it with the other. One morning Upatissa was walking toward Arahant, Rajagaha. On the way there he met a monk who looked very peaceful and seemed to be free from all fear. This monk was the Arahant Assaji, one of the 5 former ascetics. Upatissa went towards him and said, "Venerable Master, who is your teacher and what did he teach you?" Monk replied with a smile, "My teacher is a great sage of the Sakya clan. He is the Buddha, and I practice according to his teaching." Then Upatissa asked Venerable Assaji, "What is the teaching of the Buddha?" Assaji replied, "I will tell you the meaning of the Buddha's teaching very briefly. The Buddha said that there is a cause for everything, and he also taught how things decay." Upatissa was so clever that when he heard this he understood that whatever comes into existence will also decay, and he attained the first stage of enlightenment. Then he thanked Assaji, asked him where he might find the Buddha, and left. After this encounter Upatissa was filled with happiness and went straight to see Kalita. He told Kalita what the noble monk Assaji had told him. Instantly, Kalita also understood the Buddha's teaching and attained the first stage of enlightenment. Finally, the 2 friends went to see the Buddha. They asked him to accept them as monks and the Buddha agreed. After practicing diligently, they both attained arahants. Later, they became the Buddha's chief disciples and were known under their monks' names as Sariputta and Moggallana. When the Buddha was living at Rajagaha, a conference was held at Vilavana on the full moon of the 3rd month of the year. 1,250 monks attended the meeting. They were all arahants and all of them arrived on the same day. On this special occasion, the Buddha told his disciples to practice and teach following the same basic principles. The essence of this teaching was, do not do anything bad, do good and purify your mind. When King Suddhodana learned that his son had become a Buddha and was staying at Rajagaha, he sent an officer to invite the Buddha to Kapilavatthu. The Buddha promised to visit his family. So one day the Buddha took his disciples to Kapilavatthu. They arrived in the evening and stayed in a garden outside the city. The next morning, the Buddha and his disciples went to the city to beg for alms food. When the king found out that the prince was begging for food, he felt very angry and disappointed. He asked his driver to take him straight to the Buddha. When he saw the Buddha, he angrily spoke to him, "My son, today you have done a most disgraceful thing to the royal family and me. Have your ancestors ever done such a thing? Have they ever accepted food like beggars?" The Buddha spoke calmly to his angry father, "Father, I am not following the custom of my worldly ancestors. I am following the tradition of the Buddhas of the past. All past Buddhas begged for food, to inspire people to follow the teachings. Then the Buddha explained some basics of the Dharma to the king. The king calmed down and asked the Buddha and his disciples to accept food at the palace. In the palace, after finishing a delicious meal, the Buddha taught the Dharma to the king, his relatives, and other people. Then he took 2 of his senior disciples to see Yasodhara, the cousin he had married at the age of 16, and Rahula, his son. Yasodhara was very sad. The Buddha could see past lives, and he compassionately told her about the good actions she had done in the past and explained the Dharma to her. Later Rahula, who was 7 years old, was ordained by the Buddha and became the first novice in the Buddha's tradition. A novice is someone who is in training but has not yet taken the full vows of a monk or nun. Besides Rahula, the Buddha also converted his stepbrother Nanda and several princes of the Sakya clan. Among they were his cousins Ananda and Devadatta. Many years after he left Kapilavatthu, the Buddha went back to visit his father, King Suddhodana, who was very ill. The king was very happy to see the Buddha again and felt better. But because he was very old, he could no longer resist the illness, and 2 or 3 days later he passed away. Everyone felt deeply sad. When King Suddhodana died, Lady Prajapati Gautami felt very sad. She and several other women decided to leave the worldly life and join the Buddha's group of monks to practice the Dharma. So she led the women to see the Buddha. She asked him to accept them as nuns, but the Buddha refused. The women felt very disappointed and cried, but they did not give up their wish to become nuns. When the Buddha was residing at the Mahavaha monastery, Lady Prajapati Gautami and her group of women went to the monastery and told Ananda what had happened. Ananda felt compassion for them and promised to help them. He went to see the Buddha, ask him to be merciful and let the women join the monastic order. But the Buddha refused again. Ananda then said, "I beg you, Lord Buddha, please do a favor to Prajapati Gautami and accept her and other women as nuns, because she has done you a great favor in the past. She brought you up as her son." So finally the Buddha said, "All right. If they are willing to follow the 8 monastic rules I give them, they can leave home and become nuns." Then he explained these rules to Ananda. After leaving the Buddha, Ananda went to tell Lady Prajapati Gautami the good news. All the women were very happy and promised to observe the 8 rules of conduct that the Buddha gave them. Ananda then went back to the Buddha and told him that the women were happy to follow the rules. So Prajapati Gautami became the first Buddhist nun. Of all the disciples of the Buddha, Ananda, his cousin, was the most devoted to him. So the Buddha selected him to be his close attendant. Another of the Buddha's cousin became monk. His name was Devadatta, but he was envious of the. He competed with Buddha, trying to take over the leadership. Devadatta was very conceited and was jealous of the 2 chief disciples of the Buddha. So he left the Sangha, the order of monks and nuns, and made friends with the crown prince Ajatasattu, son of King Bimbisara. The prince built a private monastery for Devadatta. Devadatta then persuaded the prince to kill his father, King Bimbisara, and make himself king. The prince followed Devadatta's evil scheme and starved his father to death so he could become king. Now Devadatta felt very powerful, because the new king was his friend and supporter. So he decided to kill the Buddha. One evening, while the Buddha was walking past a rocky hill, Devadatta pushed a huge stone down the hillside, intending to kill the Buddha. But the rock suddenly broke into many pieces and only one sharp piece hit the Buddha on his foot. The Buddha returned to the monastery and was treated by the famous physician Javaka. Although his evil plot had failed, Devadatta tried to kill the Buddha again. When the Buddha was on his daily alms round at Rajagaha, Devadatta set loose a wild elephant. But as the wild elephant ran toward the Buddha, it became calm because of the Buddha's enormous loving kindness. After this incident, Devadatta gave up trying to kill the Buddha, but he still wanted to break up the Sangha. To impress the other monks and nuns and disrupt the Sangha, Devadatta asked the Buddha made stricter rules of conduct for the Sangha. He asked that monks not be allowed to sleep in houses or eat any meat. But the Buddha refused Devadatta's proposal. He said, if some monks prefer to sleep in the open or not eat meat, they are free to do so. But if they do not wish to live this way, they do not have to. Finally, the Buddha said, Devadatta, if you try to break up the Sangha, you will reap the evil fruits. Devadatta ignored the Buddha's warning, led away a group of monks, and made himself their leader. One day, when Devadatta was asleep, the Buddha's chief disciple, Sariputta, came and warned the monks about the consequences of evil actions. The monks realized their mistake and returned to the Buddha. When Devadatta woke up, he was so angry that he became ill. Eventually, he began to regret his actions, and he asked his servants to take him to see the Buddha. But he died unexpectedly on the way there.